thing that's going to really impact India is going to be this issue of illegal migration.
Legal doesn't matter. In some ways, he's insistent that immigrants are a problem.
Relationships between the India and US will become more and more based on military and strategic ties.
I think these are the elements where India and the US can continue to build the relation.
So if we have to compare Indo-US defense deals versus Indo-Russian defense deals, this is also something that UPSC has asked before, by the way. Now, how do we look at this now?
Russia has gave you advanced tech when no one else was willing to give you technologies, and that is what is part of your defense fabric today.
Where India was increasing its infrastructure and suddenly China comes in, and then we have this clash in Galwan Valley.
Very difficult for us to know exactly why Chinese did what they did.
Do you think in the South China Sea, India's naval assertiveness will be checked in the near future? How do you view differently I would say, the educational environment that we see in UK, for example, than what we see in India?
Look, we are very good at finding excuses.
Hello and welcome to the Clarity Podcast. I'm Dr. Shivin. As you know, I've cleared the UPSC Civil Services exam and now I teach for UPSC CSE at Sarthi IS. This episode of the Clarity Podcast has a guest that needs no introduction. I think he is someone who has found his name written in the UPSC answer sheets more than anyone else, especially as far as political science and international relations is concerned. My guest today is none other than Professor Pant. Sir is the Vice President of Studies and Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, a professor at the King's College London for International Relations. Sir also is a visiting faculty at IIM Bangalore. Sir has written various books, two of which are in front of me. One is Politics and Geopolitics, which is about India's neighborhood. One is China Ascendant, which is about China rising. Sir is currently focused on Asian security issues. And I think anyone who is a serious UPSC aspirant has not only mentioned his name, read his articles, but almost worships him as far as international relations is concerned. And I know I do, definitely. So, sir, thank you firstly for being here. And thank you for taking out time for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me, and you have made me overwhelmed by your remarks, but thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk to a wider audience, especially students who are trying to make their mark in any field, especially in this trying to clear services or think about IR and political science, which is my bread and butter. So it's good to share whatever I have with them.
Thank you, sir. Actually, for me, this is more like a fan moment, but you've agreed to do this and let's get right into it. So this conversation mainly is going to be about the foreign policy that India is following at the moment and the developments that are happening around the world. So, sir, right off the bat, I'd like to start off with what has happened recently with our Honorable Prime Minister visiting President Trump. So a lot of developments have come out of that. Firstly, there has been a direct new initiative called the Compact being launched and a direct talk of transfer of F-35 fifth generation fighters to India. Do you think with a more fragmented world that we are seeing today, relationships between countries, especially between the India and US, will become more and more based on military and strategic ties rather than trade and other cooperation?
See, I think we are in a world where strategic partnerships increasingly will be defined by how much political and strategic trust you have in your partner. And therefore, India-US partnership has been quite amazing. If you look at the arc of this relationship, we have seen over the last few decades, in fact, across administrations in Washington, in India, in Delhi, develop this relationship, invest in this relationship. And we have come to a point where even a president as volatile as Mr. Trump is unable to shake the foundations of that relationship. We saw that in his first term, for example. Mm-hmm. He came with a lot of issues which are very similar to today's tariffs and economic imbalance, etc. He was complaining about it. In the end, he turned out to be a very good friend of India. And I think we all know, we remember those images of Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump walking, in Houston in a huge rally. And I think that sentiment perhaps continues in Trump 2.0. It's a much different world today than it was in Trump 1.0. It's a much fragmented, as you said. But it is also, Mr. Trump is also looking at a new world order in some ways. But the one constant, of course, for both India and the US is that both want to invest in this relationship. And during this visit, which comes at a very early stage in Mr. Trump's term, I think is important because hopefully this has laid the foundations of what is likely to happen over the course of next 4 years. And so there is going to be more predictability and more stability in the relationship. And we are going to see less volatility in the engagement. That's at least the hope. And that's what seems to have happened if you look at the engagement and what has come out of this in the joint statement. The topics that you mentioned that look defense, energy and strategic matters certainly are going to dominate. With the tariff issue hovering over the relationship, I think these are the elements where India and the US can continue to build the relationship, because tariffs, there are divergences, and there are going to be divergences on the issue. India is not going to relax all the tariffs just because Mr. Trump wants it, and I think we heard the Prime Minister also acknowledge that look, we also have our interests. Trump talks about his national interest. Mr. Modi talked about his national interest, and at the end of the day, you have to find convergence within that divergence, and hopefully, as the economic negotiators of the two sides proceed now, they will be able to come to an agreement on what kind of a trade arrangement they want to build between the two democracies. But I think on the other side, which was your question, there is certainly going to be more momentum, because Mr. Trump has said that, look, you want to buy more from defense technology from us, and we are saying we are willing to buy provided you give us more technology and give us access to high-end technology. And F-35, for example, represents that segment of technology which India would be interested in buying. Whether India buys ultimately depends on its own processes, as I think the Foreign Secretary also explained, that it is not Mr. Trump says and we end up buying it. It will take some time to fructify. But I think essentially the trend line is that they want to give us high-end technology. We are interested in that technology. We want to build a technology base. We want transfer of technology. And we are also cognizant of the fact that this partnership with the US gives us some leverage vis-a-vis China, that China is our most important long-term strategic challenge. And in the short to medium term, we will need the support of the US in managing China's rise, just as America needs India in managing China in the Indo-Pacific. So I think those synergies have been leveraged, and we will continue to leverage those synergies as we proceed in engaging with each other. But certainly strategic ties, defense ties are going to be predominant as India buys more, as India makes a claim to the US that we are willing to buy from you, and perhaps assuage some of the concerns that Mr. Trump might have about India.
So two questions are arising of what you just said. Firstly, sir, as far as divergences are concerned, of course, there's a problem with tariffs. But since we already have such a favorable trade balance with the US, maybe the tariffs won't impact us so much in the short run. But I think something that's going to really impact India is going to be this issue of illegal migration. Because already we have seen visuals of how Indian citizens have been sent back. The Honorable Prime Minister has claimed that he's willing to take back these citizens. But in the long run, how do you see this issue playing out? Because maybe we don't have that space to create those jobs here. And even the retrenchment of so many illegal immigrants back to India might create a domestic issue, since that is something that we've seen how illegal migration has happened over the years through donkey and various other methods. So how do you factor this into the relationship?
See, clearly migration for Mr. Trump is a big issue. I mean, illegal, legal doesn't matter. In some ways, he's insistent that immigrants are a problem. His base believes that, and he's catering to his base in some ways. Now, I don't think there is any way of ignoring this problem. As we have seen, for example, India has openly said that, and Prime Minister said it, that look, illegal immigration is a big no-no for us, and as it should be for any country, because that should not be supported, that should not be encouraged. So what kind of mechanisms you can create? And I think his point of focusing on more on the network, on the trafficking network, is a very valid one, because that tends to happen, which was a point that you're also making, that a lot of these immigrants, particularly illegal immigrants that travel all the way to the US, go through these networks which are illegal in nature, that traffic human beings, that indulge in all kinds of criminal activities, and therefore you want to nip them in the bud. And there I think it is interesting, because it also links to a lot of the problems that, say, the state in Punjab might be facing. So he has also, Mr. Modi's intervention has also interestingly linked it with the issue of how some groups in the US might be indulging in illegal activities, which has to be looked at also when you're looking at the illegal immigration issue. But clearly, this is going to be a challenge, as you said, in terms of our domestic space, where opposition might raise this issue, where there might be some concerns as to how these people are being, treated. And again, the intervention from Indian side has been that, look, we want them to be treated humanely, and documentation should be provided. You just can't say that these are illegal immigrants, they have to be deported back to India. But of course, if the documentation is there, we are willing to take back illegal immigrants. That's in some ways. India was very quick to respond to this, if you recall, partly because on this issue, there is no ideological difference as far as the issue of illegal immigrants is concerned. Legal immigrants and citizenship birthright, I mean, we don't have much say. That's for American domestic politics to resolve. But on illegal immigration, we are on the same page with the Americans. That's what our government has said. Now, the reason I think we have been so articulate on this is that it allows us to assuage some of the American concerns in a sector so that it gives us some space elsewhere, right? If we say that, look, we are willing to tackle immigration, we are willing to also look at to buy energy from you, we are willing to buy defense equipment from you, it allows you in some ways to deal with much more contentious issues like economy and trade, where your space to maneuver might be very limited, where you would draw certain red lines that certain products, for example, we can't have. In agricultural opening might not have in India. So I think a lot of this is about issue linkages. How do you link one issue of negotiation to the other so that you in the end get a broad bouquet of issues on the table where you can give and take, broadly. And that is, I think, in some ways the deal making that you will have to do with the kind of administration you have in Washington today, who believes that deal making is important and who is willing to also use these bargaining chips, in a sense, saying that India is a big tariff problem just before meeting Modi. Mr. Trump was firing the first salvo in a long drawn out negotiating process. He has not put tariffs on India, but what he was mentioning was that, look, you have to be aware of that we are thinking about it, so you be better prepared. And I think that process will culminate in something. I'm sure both sides will reach an agreement which will be suitable, which will work for both of us. But that is the way I think India will have to deal with Mr. Trump. And I think illegal immigration and the way India was quick to assuage some of those concerns perhaps reflects to that.
So speaking of this transactional nature of relationship, like you mentioned, that defense deals are going to become more and more important. In this context, how do you now look at the defense deals that we already have with, let's say, our partners in Asia, like Russia, for example? So if we have to compare Indo-US defense deals versus Indo-Russian defense deals, this is also something that UPSC has asked before, by the way. So if you have to compare these two things, now how do we look at this now? Because I'm sure that once this relationship with the US becomes more and more transactional, President Trump will not be very okay with India going for the purchase of S-400 like we did, for example. And again, the integration between these two systems becomes an issue. So if we have to integrate the S-400 with the Sukhoi fighter, it's easier to do than to integrate it with a Rafale or a F-35 because they'll just not share the source codes with us. So when we're looking at these two deals, how do we now go forward from here?
See, there are two separate aspects to this question. One is our own domestic defense arrangements and thinking. Now, one of the problems with Indian defense policy has always been that we have been buying off the shelf. There have been no strategic thinking behind buying equipment, right? You go to the market and you see whoever is willing to sell you, give you certain things, and you keep on buying. So one of the criticisms that India has faced is that this off-the-shelf buying is not really very strategic, and it will have costs. Now, the costs actually are the costs that you are talking about, that integration. How do you integrate these multiple vendors together? How do you integrate these multiple equipment streams together? And this, in today's day and age where combined arms is the most important determinant of your battlefield performance, is going to be a challenge. You really have to look at battlefield performance in an integrated manner, both in terms of equipment, your partners, as well as the three services. That, I think, is India's Achilles heel even today. Now, so that is for India to resolve. And I think India should be thinking really hard about its defense policy in that regard as to where do we go 20 years, even 10 years now. How do we see our integration of forces? How do we see our integration of equipment? What kind of partnerships do we want which will allow you to work effectively on the battlefield? Multi-alignment is all well and good when it comes to theory, but in real battlefield it doesn't work. So you have to think through some of those challenges, and I think we are beginning to think about it. With CDS, with theater commands hopefully happening soon. I think there is a realization that we cannot wait, but there is also this challenge of, given our history, given the legacy that we carry, how can we do it in the shortest possible period in time? Now, the other aspect is external, that these partnerships that you have inculcated, they are path dependent. Right. So you started during the Cold War because the Western sanctions, you were dependent on Russia, then Soviet Union, and that partnership has continued. Russia has stood by you through thick and thin. It gave you advanced tech when no one else was willing to give you technologies, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, etc. And that is what is part of your defense fabric today. Right. Now, since the end of the Cold War, of course, we have been diversifying. The diversification process meant that America has emerged as a major defense partner. France, of course, has been a traditional partner. Israel has become an important partner. But again, it has been, a bit in fits and starts, right? So you engage some countries at some point in time, and then suddenly other countries, come back to the fore. With Russia, of course, the proportion of Russia in your defense matrix has been going down. It has not been going up. Now the challenge is that how do you manage with Ukraine, the divergences between Russia and the West forced you into making certain kinds of choices. Thankfully, with Mr. Trump, the relationship of America with Russia might improve, and that would give you that space of to think through some of these issues. But I don't think India over the last few years, while investing in the relationship with Russia, has actually been looking away from Russia on defense. So there has been a sustained effort on India's part, particularly to court the West, because the kind of technologies that the West can give you, Russia has not been in a position to supply. Right. So the role that America is going to play is certainly going to be much more important, in my view. That the US will play is going to be very, very important. Russia will remain an important partner, but it's not entirely evident that they are on the same scale and the same page. I think Russia, because of its own domestic problems, because of its own domestic lack of economic vitality, lack of resources, I think the technological momentum in Russia has suffered. And it's not on par with the US. So for us, for our services, if you ask them where would you want to go for the high end cutting technology, if it is available, they would mention that we should go to the US. You would want the best possible technology in the market. Now, if Americans are willing to share it, you would certainly want that technological partnership with the US to improve. The questions is, are they putting some restrictions on you? Are they giving you under certain conditions? If they are not putting any conditions, if they are willing to develop, co-produce and co-develop at home, then I think having a partnership with the US is certainly where India should be investing, because at the end of the day, your force posture, your equipment should be a factor of how you want to perform on the battlefield, and nothing else should matter.
Right. So I think like you spoke about walking this tightrope where we have to balance our interests with Russia. एक तरफ there's Russia and the other side there's the Americans. तो हमें हमेशा से this has been a theme of India's foreign policy. You balance this tightrope. How have we done this as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned? Because on one side, like you spoke of the war recently, so on one side there is a partner which we have had, let's say, since the Cold War, जिसने हमें support किया even during the 1971 issue, and then on the other side we have the West, who we have to now cultivate a relationship with. So इस conundrum में, how has India done so far, and what is the way ahead of this conflict?
See, balancing, of course, is part and parcel of diplomacy. So you do a lot of balancing. All countries balance. But when it comes to Russia and the West, particularly in the context of Ukraine, it had been a tough few years for India. Given the challenge, I think India has done quite well. I mean, the fact that despite Ukraine, both relationships continued to prosper, which is quite extraordinary. If you go back to when the Ukraine war started, it was all doom and gloom in India. Everyone was writing op-eds. Oh, this is going to be a disaster. India will have to make this choice, that choice. And now, if you are looking back, I think you see a much, that India was able to carve out a space for itself, which I don't think any other country was able to, because you were buying discounted oil from Russia. You managed to buy that oil from Russia. At the same time, you managed to develop your partnership with the US. Biden administration did talk about it, about the Russia problem, but they never, put pressure on you in the sense that they could have, or perhaps many in the Biden administration wanted. Similarly with Europe. I mean, Europe was really concerned about Russia. But if you look at, the arc of the relationship, it's quite extraordinary. Ursula von der Leyen, for example, she came to India. She talked about how she was displeased with India's behavior. But she came back by signing the Trade and Technology Council agreement. So there has been, I think, an acknowledgement of India's centrality in global politics, India's role that it plays today in the context of the Indo-Pacific, and how other countries view India's rise as a positive, and India itself making a go at it. Explaining its choices in ways that perhaps very few other countries were able to do. If you think of Dr. Jaishankar saying that, look, Europe thinks that its problems are the world's problems, etc. Right. And then you had India explaining why is it that they are buying oil from Russia, which is going to Europe through India. Then you had this situation that when they said, well, you're buying arms from Russia, then telling the world that, look, understand the historical context. You put sanctions on us, the West put sanctions on us, and we were so dependent for our security that we had no other option but to get the support from the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union supported us. Similarly, this idea that, look, India is standing up for its own security in a time against China in particular, when everyone else was concerned about China. But there they had treaty alliance partnerships, and here India was taking its security, on its own shoulders. So, in a sense, the role that India played has had a very important mark on these partnerships. And despite Ukraine, we have managed to do really well with our partnerships. Now, of course, the challenge is that you really, that balancing has to come to an end at some point. The good news is that Mr. Trump wants the war to end. So he is doing it on his own terms, which means that India can take a sigh of relief. Perhaps there is a breather for India now that the Russia-West equation, Russia-US equation might change, and this would give a breather to India. Because if there is no challenge there, then India is not under pressure to do anything. Right. India can continue to expand its ties with both US and Russia, while managing, its own independent foreign policy. So we have done well. I think the challenges, it seems under Mr. Trump, are going to decrease rather than increase in terms of this relationship. And that would give India greater space to maneuver.
So this particularly vociferous brand of foreign policy explanation that, foreign minister has done, where he's talked about India's interests very openly. I don't think, at least as far as my limited experience is concerned, I have not seen any other foreign minister go out and speak about India's interests so vociferously. Do you think this has further strengthened our position of wanting to have a strategic autonomy and saying that India is its own player, and Russia and let's say the Eastern Bloc, so to speak, but not really, might they want something else and the West might want something else, but hamara jo interest hai, we'll keep that in our centrality and we'll take a realist look at things. Okay, if this is our interest, this is what we're going to enforce. Do you think this expression vociferously of our foreign policy by Dr. Jaishankar specifically has helped India then even position itself better in this sphere?
I do think so. I think articulation matters, in particularly in diplomacy. How you articulate your posture and how you explain it to a wider audience matters. And India has been able to explain its side of the story much more confidently to a large section of the audience that had often looked at India as part of the problem. That India creates problems. But here was India which was saying that, look, we have our own interests. We will pursue those interests. But at the same time, we are also a country that is willing to work with the world, unlike China, which is disruptive, We don't want to be disruptive of the global order. So if you look at India's G20 presidency, India was trying to bridge the divide between North and South and East and West, trying to ensure that Russians continue to remain part of the conversation. Now, something that America is doing today. So in a sense, India's role has been very constructive in at least the perception for many in the West that India creates problems rather than provide solutions. Often that changed over a period of time, and that has changed, that India is not only articulating its interests but also articulating it in a very constructive manner, that here are the red lines for India, but that doesn't mean that we don't appreciate where you are coming from and how we can bridge those divides. So I think that sense of responsibility that India carries and articulates perhaps has greater resonance this time, and a greater degree of understanding of where India is coming from that we see, because I think often there is an implicit comparison with China. That here is another country, very powerful. Of course, India is not in the same league in terms of power, but as a rising economy, India also has equities which China has had for a long time. Now, if you look at Chinese behavior, often it comes at odds in the way it articulates. I mean, even if you look at Chinese position on Russia, I mean, it's much more anti-Western. It has taken an anti-Western tone. India has taken, that famous line that was said that, look, we are not anti-West, we are non-West. We are not a Western construct, we are not a Western power, but that doesn't mean we need to be anti-West by definition. We will work with the West because we have enough interests in working with the West. And therefore, bringing an end to the war, the Ukraine war, was very important for India because it was hurting India, but it was also hurting a large part of the global South. Right. So that was I think the issue that India put on the table, which I think many in the West at that point in time were not very comfortable with, but gradually they understood the logic of that argument. Now they have their own logic of the positions that they are taking. But I think India's position was coming not from any anti-Western orientation, but from a sense that, look, this is hurting us, but this is also hurting a large part of the global developing world, which you should think about because you're losing out there. So I think it was coming from a very positive ambition to drive the global agenda rather than any negativity around taking positions one way against one entity or the other.
Sir, I think that's also reflected in one of our G20 priorities, which was to be the voice of the global South. But sir, you spoke extensively to China, and now let's come to that issue. Sir, how important was this Bukshok-Oldi road that was made that boosted India's infrastructure on the LAC, which ultimately is touted to have led to this clash in the Galwan Valley? How central was that event, and how important was that event to whatever is now happening on the LAC?
There are two things. One, we don't know why China did what it did, in 2020. Why it suddenly decided to alter the status quo unilaterally, which had been in place for a long time and without much disruption. So they decided to disrupt it. Now, whether it was because of the infrastructure that India was building, whether it was the fear of greater capabilities that India might develop over a period of time. So whether it was a preemptive move, in a sense, to tell India that, look, don't go there, else there will be consequences. Whether it was the fear of US and India working ever more closely together, and perhaps this being a message, or whether it was something internal, Xi Jinping deciding to make a move on the border, even as he was making moves elsewhere in Taiwan Strait or in South China Sea, etc. I don't think we have any greater clue today than we had in 2020. But certainly one of the things that we know is that India's continued push for infrastructure in that very important strategic space, that has altered in some ways Chinese perception of what India is capable of doing along the border. Because you also see that as the conflict evolved since 2020. Once they decided to alter the status quo along the border in 2020, Chinese also realized that India is no pushover. So, because for the next 4 years, Indian forces were able to hold on to the positions that they had.
So, sir, what happened basically was that India bolstered its infrastructure on the border. We made an airstrip, we made new roads, and we had a compact with China from 1993, then 1996, that no bullets will be fired and the border will be there's always been a conflict on the LAC, but bullets had not been fired, conflicts had not happened for 45 years. And suddenly in 2020, there was this incident where India was increasing its infrastructure and suddenly China comes in. And then we have this clash in Galwan Valley where 20 Indian soldiers are martyred, an undisclosed number of people die on the Chinese side. And since then, the relationship has become more and more adversarial on the border. So China has always claimed that Tibet is sort of the palm and there are 5 fingers, and they've never agreed to our conception on the LAC. But why was this incident so important? And from here, what has happened to our relationship with the Chinese, especially as far as the border question is concerned?
See, there are 2 points. One is we will, for example, the first part, we would perhaps very difficult for us to know exactly why Chinese did what they did in 2020. And there might be many reasons. It might be because of Chinese interpretation of what we are doing at the border. It might be their sending a message to India that, there are risks to continuing along this policy. There might be, certainly India has been building its infrastructure along the border. And that had been a very big project, for example, of the last decade in particular, and that may have made the Chinese realize that if they don't do something now, then the balance of power may shift in India's favor. Then I think the issue of domestic politics in China is very important. Xi Jinping's motivations, no one knows. He has been creating enemies everywhere. So he decided to up the ante, in Galwan. But what we certainly know is that Chinese decided to unilaterally change the status quo along the border after, as you said, almost 4 decades of relative stability. It has been a contested border. It is a contested border, perhaps the longest contested border anywhere between 2 nations, any 2 neighbors. But the understandings that were reached in 1990s, they were about maintaining the stability, maintaining a relative calm. So no violence was happening along the border. There was a lot of tussle here and there, but soldiers were not dying. And I think then to reach a situation where unilaterally overnight you would decide to alter the status quo and kill soldiers, I think that shook India's consciousness that, look, this is terrible. We were trying to work with China with all the challenges that we had. We were, we put in place mechanisms, the whole Wuhan spirit that came where Prime Minister Modi was trying to deal directly with Xi Jinping. That did not work at all. So the issue was that you have a situation now, at least in 2020, what we saw was that the Chinese would suddenly wake up and they would discard older understandings, older treaties, older mechanisms that were created, just because they think that they are the superior party at this point and qualitatively superior to India. Now, which meant that India had to relook at its entire relationship with China. And that therefore resulted in this very, very negative relationship with China that we have seen evolve over the last 4 years. In October last year, the agreement was reached where we have restored status quo ante. Now, which basically means that the Chinese are accepting the logic of Indian argument, because the Indian argument was that unless you restore status quo ante, we will not move forward on normalization. And therefore, now that the patrolling has gone back to its usual self that existed in 2020, I think you have to acknowledge that Chinese are now recognizing that they started the problem in 2020. But in India, if you see the change, there is a cautious normalization that is happening. India has said, yes, we are willing to now restore, we are thinking of restoring air travel. We look forward to greater people-to-people ties. But there is a basic trust deficit that is nowhere close to bridging. And if you look at public perception of China in the country, that is hugely negative. So at Observer Research Foundation, we carry out annual survey on youth and foreign policy. And repeatedly, the youth of this country are anti-China. I mean, that's what the surveys tell us, that they are not, they do not see China as a friend. They see China as a problem, and in every respect a problem. Whether it is bilateral, multilateral, whether it is trade or strategy, China is not seen as a force for good. Now, that is not a healthy situation to be in. China is India's biggest neighbor, more economically very important and strategically very important. To have a stable relationship with China should be a very important foreign policy goal for India. But how do you do that in the context where a large part of the country does not really see China in a positive light? And that is, I think, going to be India's, therefore, very important most important strategic challenge. That how do you manage China's rise in an environment where Chinese behavior has repeatedly made India and Indians insecure, made them feel insecure, and has widened any trust deficit that was there in the first place.
Sir, don't you think a lot of this trust deficit is also coming from China's sort of idea to keep India boxed in South Asia? So they have effectively infiltrated is not the right word, but effectively bought influence in almost all of our neighbors, surrounded India with a set of ports, what they call the string of pearls. The Belt and Road Initiative is, expanding its tentacles into all our neighbors, especially Bhutan was out of it, but recently we've heard that they've signed a border deal with Bhutan as well. So how do you see this playing out? Like our neighborhood, our Honorable Prime Minister has always said that our neighborhood is first, but China, with obviously the fatter checkbook and also not being a part of the internal domestic politics of our neighborhood. So in our neighborhood, anywhere when someone wants to speak of nationalism, they just have to speak something against India and the nationalist forces would gather. China does not have that problem. So with that dynamic where China has sort of put investments and infiltration in almost all of our neighborhood, how don't you think that is also something that is raising this trust deficit further? And has India effectively lost in South Asia to China, or is that a misconception?
See, I think in a sense, this is what happens when the trust deficit is so high that anything that the other side does, you want to believe the worst. So let us assume for a moment that a lot of the things that the Chinese have done in the neighborhood, they've done it for purely economic reasons.
Okay.
But because of the lack of transparency in the way Chinese engage with India, because of a lack of openness, because of repeated walking back from understandings that they have had with India, there is a situation now that every move of China is seen as problematic by India. And I think in that sense, there are a lot of areas where India and China in the neighborhood, for example, could have worked together for the betterment of the neighborhood. After all, these are the two most important economies where our neighboring countries should be able to leverage their strengths. But because of our, this lack of trust in Chinese behavior, there has never been any bilateral engagement with China as far as neighborhood is concerned. And we don't want to do that because because we believe, and many in Indian security establishment, strategic establishment believe for right reasons, that Chinese are out there to scuttle our eyes. And therefore, by adopting this, this binary of always putting Pakistan and India together, see, all the other big powers have moved on from this.
The sort of dehyphenation
has happened. It is only China that continues to insist on this hyphenation. It talks of India as a South Asian power. It repeatedly, it mentions it every time. India as a South Asian power. Because I think that is where it wants to see India. It doesn't want to see India rise beyond South Asia. And, anywhere, you see India's engagement happening, SCO, if Russia would talk of India's membership, China would talk of Pakistan's membership. They want to create that binary that for them is important. They still don't talk to India on nuclear matters. Whereas every other country is engaged with India on the nuclear matters after civil nuclear deal with the US, for example. So you do see a trend where China's attempt to keep India merely as a regional power, as a merely South Asian power, has created its own backlash in India, that India now feels that it also has to operate far beyond its shores. It has to now move to Southeast Asia, which India is doing relatively well. India has to work with countries like Japan and Australia in the Pacific Islands, for example. India has to work in the Middle East. So the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific that has taken hold, that allows India that agency to move beyond just Indian Ocean and South Asia. And that Indo-Pacific logic is very strongly embedded now in Indian strategic thinking. Partly also as a counter to what China has been doing to India by boxing India in South Asia. Which brings us to this question of the neighbors. That look, for all our neighbors, in an ideal world, they should be able to work both with India and China and make the most of it. In reality, what tends to happen is that the contestation between India and China that is developing constrains their options. But they are their own masters. They are the masters of their own strategic destiny. So they will create their own space. So to think of our neighbors primarily as pawns in this wider India-China game is a wrong way to analyze their behavior, because India and China, because our neighbors are also they have agency of their own. They also play India and China against each other because they also want to get the best possible outcome.
The way India plays US and
exactly.
China. Right.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, as a relatively smaller country compared to the bigger powers, that's a strategy that everyone employs. So we employ in the context of other big powers, our neighbors employ it in the context of us and China. Now, how they pursue this strategy and whether they respect our red lines, that is something that India has to continuously negotiate. And as you pointed out, because India is so embedded in the domestic politics of these countries, it becomes very difficult. When we don't say anything, then also there is a problem. When we say something, then it creates a backlash. So it's a very thin line that India has to observe. What we have seen, for example, in the last few years is an attempt to have continuous engagement with our neighbors, which I think has produced some good results. So, for example, Maldives is a good example, right? If you take Maldives under Muizu, what happened? When he came on the back of India Out campaign, there was a lot of there was a lot of commentary in India,
a lot of bad
press,
Twitter,
right?
And
and then of course some of his ministers were off the mark when Prime Minister went to Andamans to Lakshadweep, I think.
Lakshadweep, yes.
So there was a lot of commentary around that as well. But if you observe carefully, Indian government was very silent.
So
they did not make a big fuss about Muizu. They did not make a fuss about what they were saying. They issued a statement, that's it. Gradually, I think that strategy paid off because over a period of time, you have seen Muizu now positively engaged with India, because he also realized very early on that ultimately India is the closest neighbor, as a very important economic partner, cannot just be dissed around. You have to take India into account. You have to take Indian priorities into account. You have to engage with the country. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, when China was nowhere to be seen, India was out there providing aid during the economic crisis. And that has helped India come back as a very important player. They will continue to use China as well. But I think ultimately, India's aim remains to contribute positively to regional cooperation, regional economic development. And if that continuous process is maintained, this sometimes India will find that it is in a better position, sometimes it is not. But I think the media tries to project it in a way that India loses, China wins, China loses, India wins. I mean, that's not the way foreign policies technically are run. They are, what are the long-term interests of our neighbors, and where do they coincide with us, and where do they coincide with China? I think that's for them to decide. But where they coincide with us, we will work together and we will ensure that mutually beneficial outcomes are attained. So I don't think that there is India losing situation in South Asia. After all, India is the dominant entity in South Asia. So anyone that has to operate in South Asia will have to take Indian interests into account. How we are able to accomplish that will ebb and flow. But I think broadly the trend lines and the structural realities in the region are such that we will continue to be a very important part of the dynamic of our neighbors. But often we will not be liked. And I think we should be ready to live with it. That, countries will complain about India. Our neighbors will complain about our behavior. And often we will have some very good run, like we had 15 good years of good run in Bangladesh with Sheikh Hasina. And then the trouble will start. But it is, I think, the job of diplomacy and diplomats to do. I mean, after all, they also need to have something to do. So I'm sure now with Bangladesh problem that has started, it is their job to fix it.
Also, sir, I think that India's, maybe their commitments, as far as if you compare in terms of the numbers, might have been lower than what China can commit, simply because of them being the larger economy. But India's delivery has been at least at par, sometimes even better than what the Chinese have been able to offer. If you look at the CPEC, for example, advertising $62 billion, but the real investment is much lower. But sir, coming to the other point of India operating now beyond its shores, India going to Quad, for example, and going beyond. Again, with the advent of President Trump, who's again more of a realist sort of military strategist sort of person, do you think in the South China Sea, India's naval assertiveness will be checked in the near future? Because once these Paracel and Spratly Islands and the Scarborough Shoal, etc., gets militarized, and China then makes its sort of advances towards Taiwan, will India or let's say the Quad be checked in terms of its naval assertiveness there? Or do you think that's not something that's going to happen in the near future?
See, just before I come to this, and the first point that you made about India's delivery.
Sir.
See, I think there has been some genuine issues about Indian delivery as far as our neighbors are concerned. And they have often complained that India over-promises and under-delivers, which is, I think, which used to happen in the past, where your projects would linger for a very long time. I think there has been much improvement in that regard, and Mr. Modi's one of the first initiatives was in 2014 when he had come to office, was that let's first ensure that the projects that we have committed are completed. And I think we have moved in that direction a lot, and we do see an improvement in our delivery prospects. So I think if that happens, we will see a greater degree of confidence in India, because Chinese are very good at delivery. Although on BRI and some of the projects that you mentioned, they have been off the mark, and therefore there is a backlash against BRI. But on smaller projects, bilateral projects, they do deliver, and they do these mega projects, right? They will build a big port, roads, stadium, which are very visible to people. So they're very good at marketing. Look, we have built this port. Now that Hambantota port may have been a white elephant, but that's something that they think they've delivered. So I think Indian delivery has improved, partly also under pressure, because countries were demanding that India delivers much more efficiently. And I think that's a good sign that we are learning, and we are also accommodating the concerns of
similar thing happened in Chahabar also, sir. For example, we did not deliver.
We did not do it for a long time. Iranians were complaining. Then we ended up completing the first phase, and now the Iranians want more. But now, of course, with Mr. Trump, we have to see how we go there. On the issue that you have raised about Quad and Indo-Pacific, I think that is going to be really interesting to watch, because one of the things that may happen is that Mr. Trump may decide that Quad needs to be more security focused. Till now, Quad projects itself as a force for good. It's a benign force which talks about a lot of issues which are non-traditional security, health, infrastructure, connectivity, maritime security in a non-traditional sense. Mr. Trump may decide that, look, I want to focus on security. I want this to be a targeted, focused security player in the region. It would cause a bit of a trouble for India, because India's position has been that we don't want to securitize it. Partly because of the debate within India as to where India wants to go with its policy, but also because a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN members, might be very uncomfortable if they have to choose openly between Quad and China. They have strong economic ties with China that they don't want to dismantle. So, not to annoy many of these countries, India's position was that let's focus, let's take Quad as a non-security oriented platform. But if Mr. Trump decides to take it forward, then I think the options would be limited. And there India will have to take a call as to how far it wants to go with the securitization project. I mean, on the face of it, if greater securitization of Quad gives India more leverage with the Chinese, that's not a bad thing. But you'll have to balance that with how other countries in the region might view this.
Right.
If that makes those countries, those smaller entities which are very critical in this jostling for influence, if the securitization of Quad forces those countries to move away from Quad towards China even more, then that is something that will have to be taken into account.
So, for example, President Trump also said before or during Prime Minister Modi's visit that BRICS is dead. So, with the Quad, if it does get militarized, do you think it will also have an impact on the other, arrangements that we have? For example, he was threatening 100% tariffs if we go for de-dollarization. So, do you think it's heading towards a more fragmented world here in the Indo-Pacific?
See, Mr. Trump is certainly going to ask you to choose, and he looks at the world in black and white terms, and I think he's more comfortable, and you will have to respond to that in some ways. With de-dollarization, the good thing is that, look, BRICS has never talked about de-dollarization. That's a myth. What BRICS has talked about is for the BRICS countries to be able to trade in
Have a
each other's
currency swap,
currencies.
basically.
Yes. So it is not about de-dollarization. It is more about how do you think of bilateral arrangements that are available to you in a world which is which is weaponizing financial mechanisms that are available. So that I think is going to happen. India is also doing it with a number of other countries. But the big de-dollarization project, I think that's it is not even in India's interest to frankly in the short to medium term. So I don't think there is any fear of India going in that direction. And with what is also interesting is that with Mr. Trump making this overture to Putin, what happens to Russia-China axis? How does it evolve, right? That is, I think, that will be interesting to see what Putin does, how he adjusts with China. Because a lot of our assumptions are about, Russia-China axis. Now that axis has been growing and that's a real challenge for India. But if Mr. Trump is able to break that axis in some way, I don't think he will break it completely. He will be able to break it completely. But in some ways, if he will be able to reorient it, then I think you will have a very different kind of debates, even within BRICS, that are happening at the moment.
Sir, so this is sort of bringing me towards the end of this podcast. And the last question I want to ask you is something away from international relations. So, sir, you've been teaching at the King's College in London, and you've also taught here in India, and you've had a very illustrious career. How do you view differently the educational environment that we see in UK, for example, than what we see in India? And what are the improvements that we need to make for our universities to churn out better graduates and better master students?
Such a big question, because I think one of the reasons why none of the HRD ministers have been able to do anything about our education system is because the scale of the challenge is quite big. But I think the primary issue here is how do we ensure that some of our best people go to teaching?
So,
it's not a profession that anyone thinks about intuitively, right?
Yeah.
A middle class person, if you ask them what are your priorities, where does teaching? I don't think you will ever hear teaching as a profession being talked about as a choice, as a matter of choice. So I think a lot of people who enter into teaching are either going there because they have not cleared their UPSC, they are perhaps they wanted to do something but they couldn't make it for different reasons.
By default. Not by choice.
Not by choice. And I think that by definition will not deliver best people to you, right? So, and teaching as a profession, unless you are interested, unless you are engaged, unless you think as a student, you will never be able to mobilize or generate that excitement among the students. And if you're not able to generate that excitement for what knowledge is, what learning is, what you will end up producing are students or people who will look at this merely as a conveyor belt for again sitting in another examination, rather than enjoying the process, rather than enjoying learning, rather than looking at knowledge as an end in itself. And if you don't have, ultimately, good education is about knowledge as an end in itself, right?
Right.
It becomes very mechanical if you say, all right, you do this, a good honors program for you to become a management consultant. Right. But ultimately, education should be about more than that. And that can only happen if you have some interesting character in the classroom, engaged and involved and absorbed in what he or she is doing. But how many of us remember those kind of teachers? And the ones that we remember are actually, they stand out because we remember them because no one else was doing anything in the classroom, right? So I think that is
the bar is already so
low. And the passion, I think that passion that is needed in classrooms is not there. And unfortunately, that for next generation also, then it becomes all right. If this is what teachers do, then I better off go somewhere else, and that is very unfortunate. So I think, how do you ensure that teaching becomes interesting and important as a career? And then I think something needs to be done about ensuring that we continue to produce world-class research, because ultimately teaching and research should be seen as linked enterprises.
Right.
And we don't have that. And therefore look at what China has done. And there, finally, I will end with this. Look, we are very good at finding excuses. You go to a university and university professor would tell you in India, oh, we have so much work, we have to teach so many students, and there's so many classes, and there's so much to do, so much. If your universities don't rank in the world rankings, you say Western rankings are biased. We don't want to be involved in that. We'll create our own rankings, which no one takes seriously. Now the issue is that if you compare this with what the Chinese did, 2 decades back, Chinese universities were nowhere in the world rankings. But you didn't hear Chinese complain. They put their house in order. They got the best people from everywhere. They said, you come back to China, build universities, build centers of excellence. I don't think we are doing that. We are giving excuses. We have created an alternative bureaucratic system of ranking universities in India, which I don't think even Indians are taking seriously. So I think we have to think carefully, how we think of education and how we institutionalize some of the changes that are needed. Because India's growth story, India's rise as a power will not happen unless we have this mass which is coming out, with the demographic dividend that we have, skilled, and as Prime Minister said recently, skilled and reskilled. And that can only happen if you love education, if you love knowledge for the sake of it.
So just last question before you go. It's not a question, so to speak. It's sort of any advice that you'd like to give to a student. I would consider myself also a perpetual student. So any advice that you'd like to give a student in this day and age of AI as to how we should look at our learning today?
I tell this to my daughter, who is 11 years old. Just read. Read good books. It can be fiction, it can be non-fiction. It's in the day when all you have is a screen and tablets and phones. Just take some time off and take a hard copy. It's just find a way of engaging in the world of ideas, because otherwise all you are left with is the reality of the world, which often which often puts you off. So rather than being pessimistic about the world, if you go in the world of ideas and words, it just elevates you. It may be for an hour, it may be for half an hour, but unless you read, you won't be able to think or write well. So reading for me is very important, and I see that we are not doing it enough.
I'm probably becoming a lost art. But I think I will, I've been very happy, sir, that you have come for this conversation, because, I have read books that you have written, and it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you for this time. And thank you so much for taking the time out to do this. And I hope we can see you here again sometime, maybe when another important foreign policy development happens. But for now, sir, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.